Yes, exactly.
I mean, it's nice to have conversation with you, Kim, but I mean, we
Right.
hope
We're
that
here in the business of service.
somebody's out there,
I'm
and
so grateful you
need a
told me. I would have never thought to ask, but I'm really
well,
happy
and
to know that.
I would not have thought we've been getting a lot for the church services, but the seminars, frankly, that's more than we've had, and it's not a contest. I won't
Oop,
share this with my other
3
colleagues. It's
o'clock.
not okay.
Um, I'd happily come back, Charlie, if you want me to do this again next year or 2 years.
Sounds good.
Okay, broadcast.
Okay. Good afternoon, and welcome to our Religious Life Seminar here at Lakeside, Chautauqua. We're here this afternoon with Kim Langley from Lakewood, Ohio. Welcome, Kim. It's nice to have you back. Monday afternoon session was very helpful to so many, and many have let us know that either via their comments on the social media or around Lakeside for those who are here. It is a beautiful day in Lakeside, as they say, but we're happy to have this opportunity to be able to not only share with the folks that are here, but folks around the country who cannot be at Lakeside this summer. And that is indeed a grief situation in and of itself. First of all, I want to remind you that tonight is the Wednesday night picnic in the park, that tomorrow morning we'll be having our final session with Dr. Myron McCoy, the pastor of the Chicago Temple First United Methodist Church, who is bringing us a wonderful series this week on sheep shepherding and staying on the course. It's been a wonderfully helpful time to us, and that's tomorrow morning from 9 to 10, and that is live, but also will be archived for you to watch later. And then next week, our Religious Life Seminar is going to be on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday afternoons at the train station patio, and it will be in person. And I said this morning it's live. Well, they're all live, but this will be an in-person discussion group. We're going to use the book Divided by Faith, and the subtitle is Evangelical Religion and the Problem of Race in America. And many of you are aware that we are endeavoring to look at the race issue, especially in light of early in the summer, the George Floyd killing and the subsequent difficulties around the country. And it has put that back on our radar screen in a very appropriate and in a very needed way, that we must not sweep race under the carpet, but we must deal with this in a more forthright way than we have before. And so that's next week's Religious Life Seminar, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday at the train station. Well, now this afternoon, we have Kim Langley with us and her book, Send My Roots Rain, a companion on the grief journey. And this is available to you at the Fine Print Bookstore here at Lakeside, or you can order it through the Fine Print Bookstore online. Just simply Google Fine Print Bookstore. You'll come up with it, and they will help you if you need it, if you need help, or you can just simply order it on your own. Kim is certified in several different areas. She's a spiritual director. She's president of LifeBalance Enterprises, with over 20 years experience as a retreat leader and trainer. And indeed, in the church where I serve in Cleveland, I've engaged her as a seminar leader, and she has been very helpful to our congregation. She founded Word Spa Ministries for the advancement of spiritual poetry appreciation, and she lives with her husband in Lakewood, Ohio. And we're happy to welcome her through the miracle of technology from Lakewood. Kim, welcome, and we're looking forward to our second day of our seminar together.
Thank you, Charlie. Thank you so much. And it's certainly, absolutely my pleasure to be here. And if you were unable to join us on Monday, that's going to be available on lots of platforms for you to watch, because seeing what you see today might interest you in going back to that. Monday was more for individual grievers, and I did a quick overview of like anticipatory grief and ambiguous loss. And we talked about the Warden's 4 stages of mourning, which most researchers now agree are more helpful than Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages, which were actually intended for the dying, not the grieving. And so although she did beautiful work that continues to help people, it's not that helpful for grieving. So if you are actively grieving, or you want to share this with a friend or family member, I think you will find that material on Monday very helpful. And today we'll lean on that material, but we'll look more at the pastoral ministry aspect of using poetry in spiritual care. So let me start by saying that, let me tell you just a little bit, like 1,000 years ago, I was English major in college, and I have loved poetry ever since I was a child, thanks to a book that my Aunt Viola, great Aunt Viola, gave me when I was a kid, that I was completely smitten with poetry. I used to memorize it as a child. And I took so much poetry in college that they said, if you don't take the American novel, we can't graduate you. So that'll tell you that I was bitten by the bug early. And then as the years went by, I had the opportunity to teach The Artist's Way, which is a book I know is probably known to many of you, about spirituality and creativity. And I led groups on The Artist's Way by Julia Cameron for 10 years. I was raising kids during that time and working full-time for a parish, a big one in Greater Cleveland. And I realized that I had become so busy that I hadn't been making time for poetry for some years in my life. And I felt like I was living with one hand tied behind my back. So thank you to Julia Cameron and The Artist's Way, I re-engaged with poetry as I could, as a busy working mom. And when the kids were grown, I started looking for ways to use poetry in retreat work and spiritual direction. And I had the opportunity to lead poetry circles at a couple retreat houses here in Greater Cleveland. And so I want to quickly say, if you're one of those people that thinks you don't like poetry, or you don't get poetry, or you're not even sure why you're here today, please hang with us for a little while, because part of the case I want to build today is that there's poetry and there's poetry. And there are certain kinds of poetry that, honestly, when I read them, they make me feel stupid. If you don't know the whole biography of the poet, if you don't understand all their background, their life events, you don't even know what's going on. And that poetry is great for some folks, and I don't want to criticize it, but it's not for me. Like, I don't have a lot of patience with poetry that is not understandable to the average Joe and Josephine, which is me. So we're going to talk today about poetry as a healing art. And this may be the first time anyone's ever spoken to you about that, because the healing arts have taken off with a bound in the last 25 years. Hospitals and hospices all have a healing arts department now, and people are using music therapy and art therapy to help people with their grief and insight and so on. And poetry is a healing art that is gaining in popularity, and there's an increasing amount of research that shows how writing and discussing poetry is extremely helpful, especially when people are going through difficult transitions like illness, or they have a life-threatening illness, or they've experienced a death. So I'm going to talk to you today both about why poetry makes a difference. We're going to look at a couple poems that you could imagine yourself using with a friend or in ministry, and I'll also give you a little taste of the book, because these are poems from the book. And then I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how easy it is actually to find poems that really open up conversations, pastoral conversations, and allow people to take a deeper dive into themselves, even when they're not used to doing that. So I'm sorry, I need to do this. So let's start by saying, wait, there we go. Let's start by saying that this is the landing page for my book at Paraclete Press, as in Greek word for the Holy Spirit, Paraclete. And they were a marvelous publisher for me, because they contracted for me to write the book in 1 year, and they gave me 4. It took me 4 years to write this, but it was such a labor of love, and they let me write the book that I wanted to write. And they have a very large selection of grief materials. So if you lead grief groups, or if you're a chaplain or a funeral director or in pastoral ministry or clergy, Paraclete Press has kind of chosen as one strong area of their ministry to publish DVDs and books on grief, and I am so honored to be part of that group. And at the bottom, there's a quote that's on the back of the book from Reverend Molly Bolton, who until very recently was a chaplain at the Cleveland Clinic, which has a marvelous training program. And she also helped with another friend, Ginny Douglas, to vet about 1,000 poems before we came to the 70 that are in the book. So the ones that are in the book are very, as they used to say in the commercial, kid tested and mother approved. They're ones that I know gave me that click, made me want to go to my journal, made me want to take it to prayer or to meditation. And I know from leading grief groups and working with individual grievers that there are poems that also work their kind of miracle or their alchemy in that way, right? So I'm not trying to sell books here. I'm just trying to introduce the idea that this is a kind of neglected area of healing arts ministry, and I'm a woman on a mission to remedy that. So what I hope to do today is first make the case poetry belongs in spiritual care, that we'll look at it quickly at a mindful reading process, which many of you will already know as Lectio Divina or divine reading, that's been in use, came from Judaism actually into Christianity, and then has been in use with monks, starting with Benedict, the founder of the Benedictines, who really urged his monks to use this mindful reading process every day. And I call it mindful reading because some people are afraid of Latin, and this makes it easy for everybody to understand. And then we'll describe uses of selected poems in one-on-one visits that you might make. And we'll experience a few poems as examples of how they work away in us or in the person to as I would say, to do God's work. All right. So again, if you have metrophobia, which is something we talked about earlier, there's actual name for fear of poetry. Hang in there with me, because as C.D. Wright said, I am completely convinced that poetry is nothing if not equipped for a crisis. And when you think about it, when do people reach for poems? Often at marriages, at funerals, baptisms, and so on. It's like when people know that there's something important needs to be said here, they often reach for a poem. So how do we know what kinds of poems will help us in our ministry? Well, if you're a chaplain, for example, you want to make sure that there's a good match between the poem and the patient. So I interviewed dozens of chaplains, clergy, spiritual directors, and individual grievers when I was doing the book. And the book was so deeply enriched by their wisdom. I want to give credit to that. It was very open sourced and in a beautiful and I would say providential way. And so several of the chaplains who are using poetry in ministry said to me, now make sure people understand that this is not a one size fits all. Just like you wouldn't go in and kind of hit somebody over the head with a scripture passage or, insist that they pray with you in a certain way. You're using poetry in a tentative way, in an invitatory way. And you're always starting with conversation that helps you to kind of assess where the person's at, where does it hurt, what's the nature of their spiritual pain. And then if a scripture is the best message for that, if they're a believer already and deeply embedded in their church and have a whole history of the Psalms, for example, then that's probably the right avenue for that person. But what many that I interviewed said, and of course I was already aware of this because of the work of Diana Butler Bass, who I'm sure is known to many of you. Diana Butler Bass has really been an interesting writer in the last years about the future of the church and what's going to happen to churches as more and more people, which is what we're seeing, don't attend a church anymore, or might move in and out of churches, or they don't necessarily belong to the community, or there's deeply spiritual people, but nothing could persuade them to walk through the doors of a church because they've had a bad experience or they're somehow allergic to traditional worship. And so she talks about, and I borrow her language, she talks about those people as the nones, N-O-N-E, not nuns in F, N-O-N-E, because when they're surveyed about what religion they follow, as often happens when you're hospitalized, for example, they check none. And that doesn't mean they're not spiritual. It means they don't consider themselves religious. So chaplains are really learning how to broaden their toolkit because they're trying to help people find peace at end of life and loved ones find peace with their deaths, who are increasingly atheists or agnostics or seekers, not maybe the traditional person that a chaplain may have ministered with 50 years ago. And so one of the reasons I'm on fire to spread the word about poetry as a tool, a powerful tool for us. I mean, I can certainly consider myself a Christian in Christian ministry, is because we're often doing ministry with somebody who may not at all identify with any of the traditional majority religions in the United States. So here's the way the conversation often goes, according to chaplains I talk to. So, hi, I'm Chaplain Smith, and I'm here. I'd be happy to talk to you if you would like. And I wonder if there's a scripture or you'd like me to read, or would it be okay if I prayed for you? And increasingly, people will say, well, chaplain, I really appreciate you visiting, but I don't really have anything I want to talk about. And all that religion stuff, it's not really for me. And so the chaplain knows that everybody has a spirituality, including this person in front of them, but the person might never use that language. And so when they get, can I read scripture? No. If the person is Muslim, they'll say, would you like me to read from the Quran? Well, I'm not so sure. Would it be okay if I pray with you? Well, just tell me a little bit about what's going on with you, or how has it been for you since you've been in the hospital, or since you've been keeping this vigil with your loved one who's close to death, And then once they have a sense for the place that person is in, they might say something like, I have some words here in my folder that have meant a lot to me and that I think might be helpful to you in the situation you've described. Would you like to hear them? And the answer almost 100% of the time is yes. So poetry seems to be able to open a door to spiritual conversation with many people that even, our beloved scriptures or other holy readings don't open for everyone evermore. And that's why I put up this quote by John Keats, that our skill then, what I'm going to unpack with you today, is that we want to choose a poem that's a good match between the person and the poem, so that the poetry strikes the reader, the person we're in dialogue with, as a wording of his own or her own highest thoughts and appear almost a remembrance. In other words, the gift poetry has to offer is that poets take so much time to wordsmith a poem, even one that's only a page long, usually represents hours and hours and hours and hours of work and returns for revisions again and again before it's published. And that wordsmithing tends to result in distilled language that helps us to acknowledge something that we felt but couldn't say. So the whole idea here is, yes, that's how I feel, or I get that. And then right alongside it comes the comfort of someone else has felt what I feel. So whereas most of us know that it's not that skillful to say, I know exactly how you feel, because that's very off-putting, coming up with a poem that may help to articulate what the person feels is a very powerful way of joining with that person, showing them you're safe, showing them you get it, and making them your partner in discussing whatever is on their minds or whatever their spiritual pain is. Now, in order to do this, we have to make sure that the tool we pick up, the poem we pick up, is not off-putting, because our whole goal here in using poetry instead of something more overtly religious is not to be off-putting and to meet the person where they're at. So I have a couple caveats, including that people in ministry, spiritual directors, chaplains, and so on, people in hospice work, should cautiously avoid poems that are sing-song. So no matter how much you love the poem from your childhood that was in your reader, I think that I shall never see a poem lovely as a tree. That's not usually the kind of poetry that strikes a chord. Certainly with younger folk, if you're with a person who is your same age and who you think had the same reader, that might work. But in general, my 10 plus years of experimentation have shown me that people do a little bit more, they feel a little more comfortable with more informal, contemporary verse that just expresses thoughts, but doesn't necessarily have a lot of rhyme and so on. Now, this is not a forever rule. No rule is hard and fast. And in my book, you'll find some that do rhyme and have regular meter, but they're very easy to access, and they don't sound like a greeting card. That's one of the problems with the sing-song poems, is they often sound like an inspirational greeting card. And those cards, even though I have a small collection of them that I've loved from my youth, like I bet a few of you received graduation cards that had the poem "If" on the front of it by Rudyard Kipling. If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you. It's very ennobling. It's very, it's lofty verse. I like Kipling, all right? But a lot of people don't. That's my point. And those poems tend to tell the hearer how to feel. So, I mean, listen to that. If you can do this, if you can do that, if you can, and the message is always rise above, take the high road. An important and beautiful message, one of the reasons I love it. But at the end, he says something like, you'll be a man, my son, It's funny that, I got that as a graduation gift. That's where we were then. And so it tells the person, do this and this and this and this and this, and then you can say you rose above it, or you fought the good fight, or etc. And when people are in the pits, when people are circling the drain, they don't often take well to being told how to feel, whether that's overtly or whether it's by implication. So if any of you have suffered losses yourselves, and I imagine you have, you probably know what I mean when people say, buck up, or get over it, or smile. You look so nice when you smile. It doesn't ever make you want to say, I've seen the error of my ways. How could I continue in my sadness? I should smile. I look so nice when I smile. Nobody does that. Instead, you kind of back slowly away from that person and think, boy, you really don't get it. So we don't want to be the person who really doesn't get it. We want to be that person who works on perfecting our presence, our skills of being really present to the person wherever they are, without judgment, and without trying to make them see the rightness of our position, but rather dealing with people in our own ministries, really the way God deals with us. When you're ready, you'll listen. When you knock, the door will open. I'm here. God doesn't force God's love on us. God doesn't force us to grow. Opportunities in life present themselves that invite us to grow. God doesn't hold our head down in a basin while we're sputtering until we say, okay, I give up, I'm ready. And so we don't want to do that in ministry either. I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but very occasionally it has become necessary to explain in this way. So I'm doing it. All right. So in addition to what we can offer others by collecting a small group of poems, such as the ones I've collected in my book, or there's another very fine poetry book called The Poetry of Presence. It's collected by Phyllis Cole, Cole -Dai, D-A-I, Phyllis Cole -Dai, Dai. And those are deliberately selected to be mindful poems that inspire reflection and so on. They're not all grief focused the way the ones in my book tend to be, because my book had a specific mission, but it's another example of where you could find things that would be resources for you. Mary Oliver has written many, many, many mindfulness-oriented poems. And if you are not acquainted with her work, I think you would love her book, Devotions, which she collected in her 80s, near the end of her life. And she called it Devotions. Interestingly enough, they're not all overtly spiritual poems, but they are all spiritual poems in my view. And she collected what she thought were her best poems, and it's a marvelous collection. So poems can help us become more resilient as people, as grievers ourselves, and as ministers to the grievers. Rainier Maria Rilke, who's poetry I love, and he's represented in the book at least twice, said, "Go into yourself and see how deep the place is from which your life flows." Boy, I love that so much. That's the kind of thing I write in the front of my journal, make a little sign of and hang up so I see it every day. It's the kind of thing that when we choose to live in that spirit, we live an examined life, and we reap the benefits of living an examined life. So poetry is a strong tool in living an examined life. Florida Scott Maxwell put Rilke's thought in a little different way that I also love, and I also hung this over my desk for many years. You need only claim the events of your life to make yourself yours. When you truly possess all you have been and done, you are fierce with reality. And who needs to claim the events of their life to make themselves theirs more than people who are caregiving and suffering anticipatory grief, knowing this can't end well and they're going to lose a loved one eventually? Who needs to claim the events of their life and make sense of them more than people who have a life-threatening illness and are dying? Who needs to do that more than the people who accompanied them down that road to death? I don't think anybody. So caregiving and facing our own mortality and grieving the mortality of others is an amazing opportunity to become fierce with reality, not broken by reality. Although I have to say, I certainly felt broken sometimes when I was going through a period of intense grief myself, but opened up, broken open by reality, rather than broken apart. So when we do, kind of either know that we already love discussing poetry or take a little risk to do it. And by the way, you're very welcome to email me at kimlangley10@gmail.com. If you want to experience a poetry circle, we're doing them by Zoom now, so anyone can come from anywhere in the country. We just had one a week ago, and it was marvelous. We had 34 people there from 6 different cities and several states. And the conversation was rich, as it almost always is, because poetry promotes that kind of richness. And I choose poems that have that click, that turn or that aha that makes us open our eyes and eager maybe to hear what other people have to say about it. So when you enter into this willingness to share poetry with one person or with a group that you're facilitating, you're part of a really long communal tradition, because for most of the history of the world, poetry was an oral activity. It wasn't something you did quietly in an armchair by yourself. It was a shared community experience, and a rich one. I've seen videos of a man in Greece who has memorized long sections of the Iliad and the Odyssey, and who performs them in the center of town in a cobblestone square in the evening with a bonfire in the middle, hundreds of people from 2 to 92 circling him. In the video I saw, he has a wooden sword as a prop, and he's gesticulating wildly, proclaiming these lines from the Iliad or the Odyssey with vigor and so putting so much life into them. And that's how poetry was recited for most of the history of the world. It was a living, breathing communal activity. And I'm happy to tell you that in recent years in the United States, there's been a strong revival of poetry as a living, breathing art, with poetry jams and recitations in taverns and so on. And in many other countries, we had kind of a die down of poetry in the United States, but in a lot of other cultures, poetry is still a very important part of everyday life. And, I might write a poem to my husband on our anniversary, or I might enclose a poem I've written in a card that I'm sending a friend who's moving out of town. So you're standing on the shoulders of giants when you take on poetry as one of the tools in your ministry. And our mothers and fathers in the faith certainly understood the Psalms as poetry, and use them all the time. So that's one thing. Second thing is that poetry, because of what I said earlier, is very inclusive and safe. It welcomes all seekers. It doesn't keep anybody out because they're not a particular faith, and it brings all in and makes it okay to talk about the deeps, those deep questions that come to you at these difficult times in your lives, no matter what your background is. Poetry will open up that conversation. I had somebody who has been leading grief groups for 15 years in the Cleveland Catholic Diocese with a partner, and the two of them, of course, are very experienced. And they were starting a new grief group in the fall, and they had purchased my book in April when it came out. And they opened the first session by handing out a copy of one of the books or poems that's in section 1 of the book, called Grief Comes with a Ladder. So everybody has a copy of it on paper, and they're reading it out of the book. And one of the highlights of Grief Comes with a Ladder is the lines, "Grief comes with a ladder, though not for ascending." And then it talks about how you have to go down before you go up, which is not only, true, I think, in our experience, but really echoes the work of Brene Brown, a researcher who I'm sure is known to some of you. And if not, boy, look her up. She's doing beautiful work. Brene, Brene, and then Brown, like the color brown. She's all over YouTube. Her books are marvelous. And her research is in the area of vulnerability. And she's definitely striking a chord in the American psyche, because she's become hugely popular. In fact, Netflix did an hour and a half of interviews, and it was widely watched. It was great. I watched it twice. Anyway, her research shows that if you're not willing to be vulnerable, if you're not willing to go down the ladder of grief, then you may, close off parts of yourself thinking you're sparing yourself suffering. But in fact, when you close off those kind of low feelings, you also tend to cut yourself off from the high feelings. So when you can't experience depths, you don't experience heights. And so people who are emotionally closed tend to live in the middle, where there's not so much joy, there's not so much exuberance, maybe not as much gratitude. And what a sad way to live, So to experience the whole range of humanity that I think the divine intends us to feel, we want to become open to feeling grief, even though it's exquisitely painful, and working with it, and psychologists would call this, doing the work of grief. And this is well researched. Moving to the next bullet, essential for making meaning. A lot of the recent research in grief work is saying that in addition to tasks like acceptance and finding a way to live into a new normal and so on, being able to make meaning out of the relationship that we had with the person who's dead now is a really important part of the grief work. So, I have one friend whose daughter died at a very just in her mid-20s, when she was at the height of her power, so to speak. And my friend has learned to carry that grief. She actually has a poem in the book. But, you never get over something like that. That's why I always avoid words like closure, and even healing can make some people feel kind of allergic. In a way, there's a way in which they don't want to heal, because they always want that life to be part of their life. They always want those memories to be part of their life. And so when you can make meaning, when you can find ways to stay connected to that person, that's a really important grief thing. So letting others know that you would like to talk about them, that you want them to say their name. They shouldn't be afraid of making you sad by telling stories about the loved one who's died, because you're already sad, and it actually comforts you to hear stories and to hear their names said. Nobody wants their friends and family to act as if the person never existed. And then other methods like planting a tree, or having a piece of jewelry crafted that reminds you of the person. Or in the Victorian times, people used to put a lock of their hair in a locket and wear it, or a picture of yourself on one side of the locket, a picture of the loved one on the other side. The Victorians wouldn't have called these mindfulness mourning activities, but that's what they were. And one of the things I put in my book at the suggestion of some of the therapists that I interviewed was a list of optional completely, of course, optional mindfulness activities at the end of each of the 4 sections to help people find ways to make meaning out of their loss. All right, poetry in one-on-one visits or in groups also employs a very flexible method, which we'll experience. And then when I say flexible, I mean not anything you have to be scared of, not anything you have to say, am I doing it right? All right, you use your open, broken heart, your own open, broken heart, and your ability to be present to others in their pain to employ this method and to choose poems for yourself. And you probably won't go wrong. And then last but not least, poetry, when brought into ministry, it helps us to be mindful. It helps us to be contemplative, and it is consoling and disturbing in all the right ways. So we'll see some examples of that. I wanted to share with you also, and I hope some of you will jot down and then later visit the wordspa.net website. And this is what Charlie was kind enough to refer to when he introduced me. I started this ministry. WordSpa stands for Word Spirituality Poetry Appreciation. And since the book came out, I've really built up the website. So there are bookmarks for you to download for free and share with grieving friends or use yourself or distribute to a group that you work with. They're easy to download and print. There are interviews with me. There are articles, and there are PowerPoint presentations if you want to use the book to lead a grief group, for example. And some of the positive feedback that I've been getting, and I'm going to come back to that story of the woman who wrote to me after she and her co-facilitator started that fall group. She gave them each a copy of Grief Comes with a Ladder. They talked about it for a few minutes. And she said the first night of the grief group never went better in the 15 years that she was leading it. Like, what? I was so honored and complimented. I feel a little shy telling you that story, but I'm not bragging. I'm bragging about the poem and what the poem can do for people. Because what happens is people are enculturated to start at the level of chit chat, and it takes weeks sometimes for people to be willing to share a little bit of their own journey. But a poem helps everybody meet on the same page. And you're not talking about yourself exactly. You're talking about yourself in the light of what the poem brought out in you, which feels a lot safer to people. So if you would think of ever using this book with a group, there's resources, lots of them, to introduce this idea. The ideas I'm sharing with you are all encapsulated in PowerPoint decks that are there free for your use. You can download them and change them however you want and use them. When I was working on this book, just starting it, I was like, should I, shouldn't I? And I've been asked to write this book by Paraclete Press, and I'm working on a proposal, but I don't know. And a lot of it was my own fear, honestly. And I interviewed some chaplains, and some of them were leading grief groups. And I said, what kinds of things are you using now to lead grief groups? And how is that for you? And is another resource needed? And several of them said to me, they really encouraged me. They said, here's the thing. We have some materials that we might use for a 6-week grief group. And the group really bonds, and they're getting a lot of comfort from one another. And then it's done, and we don't have anything else. So they'll say, well, what are we going to do next? And we're like, well, that was it. This is the material we have. And so some of them started to use Send My Roots Rain as a follow-up, because now people are over some of their most horrific feelings about the grief, and they're ready to expand into other areas. And that's what I hope the book does. So as Mary Oliver said, people come from delight or the scars of damage to the comfort of a poem. And I included this Hindu proverb, not to say that what your faith is not a great one. Please don't ever read it that way. But to say that, in my view, there are a lot of ways to God, and I think God's okay with that. And in my view, poetry helps us to accompany everybody who's on their way up the mountain, whether they see themselves as a believer and they're an elder in the church, or they're, like a lifelong Christian, or whether they're still, figuring it out. Poetry is a tool for that group, and as such is a really powerful tool in your toolbox. It's easy to find excellent poems that invite exploration and are non-denominational, making it a useful tool for everyone. If the person is already deeply rooted in a denominational belief, they'll bring that to the poem. If the person isn't, they won't be allergic. So William Carlos Williams said, "It's difficult to get the news from poems, yet men die miserably every day for lack of what is found there." And I suspect women do too. And why? Because most people aren't poets because it's going to make them wealthy. I don't know any wealthy poets, actually. Mary Oliver, a Pulitzer Prize winning poet in the United States, was interviewed when she won the prize, and she told people how she took all these like minimum wage jobs and never pursued a real career because her career was poeting. And when she was asked, have you written such good poetry for so long? She said, "I was careful never to take an interesting job." In other words, she didn't let anything distract her from being kind of a spokesperson for society, a philosopher. Mary Oliver actually started out as an agnostic and converted to Christianity, Catholic Christianity, in her later years. I think poetry absolutely moved her closer to God, and she found God there, and she was interested in helping other people open their eyes too. She did it well. So, we have to laugh at ourselves because we haven't all had the most positive experience with poetry. I've already told you there's an actual word for it, like agoraphobia or arachnophobia. There's metrophobia, and it runneth amok. And one of the reasons for that is that I was a former teacher myself. I was a high school theology teacher at the beginning of my career. And then I taught scripture for 15 years on the college level. And so I know the rigors of teaching, and in no way am I trying to criticize anybody who undertakes that noble profession. But I also know that sometimes people get kind of stuck teaching something that they don't have a lot of passion for or aren't deeply grounded in themselves. And that can happen. I know this from watching with my own kids' education with poetry. So I remember when my daughter started her poetry unit in high school, the very first day the teacher said to the class, "I don't really get poetry." Maybe wasn't the best way to invite the students into opening their minds up to exploring this new art form. But why? Because she probably never had anybody help her unpack it in a way that made sense to her. If your only exposure is, people who've been dead for 300 years and use antiquated language and all have perfect rhyme schemes, and you don't know what they're talking about, you think you don't like poetry. But once you encounter contemporary poetry, a lot of people feel differently. And that's one of the reasons why when I use poetry with somebody, I don't even call it poetry a lot of times. I just say, let's open our spiritual direction session today with this little reading. And I share a copy of it with them, and they read it once and I read it once. And then we have silence, we pray a little bit, and then we open up our session. And sometimes they start with something that the poem brought up in them. Sometimes they don't. Often they do, though. It's fascinating how poetry starts a conversation. So when you do mindful reading, I invite you to call it that with people, unless they're comfortable with more formal words. And there's such a long history of mindful reading, Lectio Divina, that I think we can feel very confident that there's something about it that really resonates in the human heart, and something in the human brain that really likes this methodology, else it would have died out hundreds of years ago. So it was a formalized part of Christian monastic life. It was borrowed from the Jewish reverence for scripture and the way scripture was read and studied in Jewish groups and singly. And then Abbot Benedict especially was a champion of this form of prayer for his monks starting in the 6th century. If you're interested in the roots of Lectio Divina, it can be traced, and has been, by scholars from Judaism to Origen to Ambrose to Augustine and to the Benedictine traditions unfolding through the centuries. The Jesuits use a form of mindful reading in their discernment processes, and So, and I'm sure many of you have also. So you might want to look that up if you're a history buff and see where it's come from. But for our purposes, I'm just going to borrow a couple of the classical ideas, so because we want it to be really simple so that anyone can enter into it without feeling like they have to have a technique. So the poem, just like when it's applied to scripture, mindful reading of a poem is read and heard in a listening manner with the ear of the heart. And when I say read, even when you're alone, people who are more expert in the healing arts than I would say that you should read it out loud to yourself so that it comes out your mouth and the words fall on both your ears. So all the wordsmithing that the poet has done is with an attention not only to the meaning they want to convey, but also to the artfulness of it, how it sounds, how it falls on the ear, and so on. And then once one has listened with the ear of one's heart, then you invite the other person or the group you're working with to be attentive to the phrase, the sentence, or the one word that they noticed. And that's one of the reasons that we usually read it twice. So if I'm doing, spiritual direction, or if I was a chaplain, I might read it out loud first. And then if I would never pressure somebody to read, some people don't like to read out loud, and you never know who might have dyslexia or some other disability that makes reading uncomfortable for them. But I invite them to read it out loud if they want to, so that it falls on our ears in two different ways with two different voices. And by the time people have read it twice, they usually do have some words or phrases that stick out for them. And having it in the book or on a piece of paper is valuable. Also, because then they can underline or they can make notes during that quiet period before you kind of open it up for discussion. All right. So then we reflect on the text and we think about how it might apply to life. We reflect on phrases or words that draw us, or, and this is really important when you're inviting someone, as I'm inviting you, because we're going to do this in a minute, or that invite resistance. Not everybody likes every poem, and the poem may fit the situation perfectly. You may have done a really good match, all our friends John Keats, but because there's pain involved in our work with people might not be ready to leap up and see that. So I remember leading a group one time. It was a grief group, and I was using one of the poems in the book called Widows. And we included widows because it beautifully captures the dynamics of families, how different family members will grieve differently and sometimes even criticize the way one another grieve, or any dysfunctions that were in the family before the death occurred. Well, they don't evaporate overnight because there was a death. So sometimes families can temporarily become more dysfunctional rather than pulling together, the way we would hope they might. So there can be a lot of resistance. So we read the poem Widows twice, and I gave people silence. And then I asked them to speak their word or phrase in the circle. Okay, so far, so good. Everybody's participating. And then I open it up for conversation. And I usually do that in a real simple way. You find a way that works for you, or borrow my phrase. I usually just say, so what do you think? Or who wants to offer something about what we've just been reading? Really simple, like wide open. And this woman comes right out with, I hate this poem. And I said, great, because we just want poetry to bring something up in us. We're not going to judge that. So when we talk about poetry, we want to see, where does it draw us? Where does it maybe repel us? Sometimes the same poem will do both in 10 lines, and that's okay, because what's the point? The point is mindfulness. The point is something comes up to the level of acknowledgement that was in there, but that couldn't be articulated before. And if it's, I hate this poem, great. So of course I said, are you willing to say more about that? Can you tell us a little bit about why you hate this poem? And she said, well, my sister, and then she launched into this painful memory of things that her sister had said that were not the most tactful. And she certainly didn't feel supported. And this poem brought that all up for her. And we talked about that a little bit. So, I'm not a therapist, although if you're a therapist on here, there is a National Association of Poetry Therapists in the United States, and you can take classes with them and become a member and get certified as a poetry therapist as a special certification in addition to your LPCC or whatever your certification is. And I have a lot of respect for that group, but I'm not a therapist. So it's always important for me and for other people who have a pastoral ministry background to recognize boundaries. So we're not doing therapy with people, we're doing pastoral counseling with people. And so say, for example, I'm doing spiritual direction with somebody and I use poetry and we've been getting together for maybe 6 months. And it's becoming increasingly clear to me that the issues the person came to spiritual direction for are really more therapeutic issues than, issues about, so where do you see God working in your life right now? And the person isn't asking me to help them learn to pray, or the person isn't trying to discern what God's will for them. The person has a lot of family of origin pain to unpack, or the person appears as if they may be OCD or have some other issue that that requires more training and expertise than I have. Well, then you folk in ministry know that our moral obligation there is to not be an enabler for that person, but to make a skillful referral for them. Now, some people feel that they can't do spiritual direction or pastoral counseling with someone until they have finished therapy. Others, experts I've read said it could be ethical to continue to do spiritual direction with someone while they're in therapy, as long as they don't keep trying to blur the boundaries of asking you to do therapy with them, which you're not qualified to do. So I just want to throw in here that big things will come up sometimes in a grief group. If you lead a grief group, you already know this. And sometimes I wouldn't say sometimes, always a grief group leader or clergy, chaplains need to have a good grief counselor referral or two in their pocket to share with somebody who clearly needs that. And then be ready with words of encouragement and helping them to see that, therapy doesn't mean that you're hanging by your fingernails. If you have a heartache, you go to a cardiologist. If you have a pain in your foot, you go to a foot doctor. And if you need to do some work with your brain and your past and trauma, you might go to a therapist. And grief therapists are really versed in how earlier traumas will come up at a time of grief. So recently I did a webinar with another woman from Paraclete who's very good, and she is a grief counselor. She actually started a grief counseling center at Austin, Texas, and she's both a spiritual director and a grief counselor. I learned so much from her. Her name is Chris with a K, K-H-R-I-S Ford, like fording a river, Chris Ford. And Paraclete's going to invite her to do a webinar September 9. So if any of you are interested in her sharing her expertise with you, I urge you to go to the Paraclete Press website or get on their email list and look for it. Anyway, I learned a ton from her, and I'm continuing to learn from her because I bought her DVD on how to lead a grief group. And she said to me when we were preparing our work together that she got into grief work in part because she lost a son when he was only 15 years old. And this was many, many years ago. And she has, of course, done lots of grief work around that loss. But when the pandemic hit, it grabbed her by the throat again in a new way. She said the first couple weeks of the pandemic, I was not only grieving the loss of my old lifestyle and the work I had been doing, and as many of us did, the easiness with which we saw our families and so on. She said, I wound up doing a layer of grief work for him all over again. So poetry, if you put good boundaries around it, and I actually talk about that in the book, how to help people know that you're safe, that they can bring things up, and that you won't always be able to process it with them because some of those are more correctly processed in another place, but that you're sympathetic and that others may have experienced the same thing, but you're not going to try and fix it for them. All right. So to put people at ease, I also almost always use these words. What we're doing here is not an academic endeavor. It's not about how smart we are. We're doing very personal readings here that just get our brains going and open our hearts and help us do our work. We don't have to impress each other. And once the poet puts the poem out in the world, it's ours. And we don't have to keep asking ourselves, what does the poem mean? This is the biggest thing, I think, that turns people off to poetry in school or other places they experiencing it. What does the poem mean? That implies that there's a right answer and a wrong answer. Even poets don't like that question. I've heard many poets say a better question is, what does the poem bring up in you? Where does the poem strike you? Where does it draw you or repel you? And so on. It's okay to give people permission to do a very personal reading. Sometimes they won't agree with each other. So what? Our goal isn't to be right. Our goal is to learn about ourselves and, in a religious context, to learn about our relationship with God and God's will for us. So when we want to introduce a poem in a pastoral visit with a patient or a family, here are some ways that I do it. Real low key. Is it okay if I share some words with you now? Or offer a choice. Start with scripture, for example, or their sacred text, like you're a Christian chaplain, but they're a Muslim, offer to read something from the Quran with them, or something from the Hebrew scriptures, which Muslims and Christians both hold sacred. But a lot of times, as I said before, when I interviewed chaplains, that they would get a no to that. No, I'm not really a churchgoer chaplain, and I don't really go with all that stuff. And then, or would you like me to pray with you? Well, it's okay if you want to say a prayer, but I'm not really a prayer person, so I'll just listen. This is not meeting our goals to make a connection with this client and to help them with their spiritual pain. So that's when you often pull out a poem, or maybe they'll just say something you think, oh, that such and such a poem that I have in my repertoire is perfect. So some people in ministry have been purchasing the book on Kindle, for example, so they can carry it around with them on a tablet or on their phones. But in a minute, I'm going to show you in a real old school, simple way that you can carry poetry around and use it. And you don't have to buy the book to do it. Right. Or a chaplain actually gave me this idea. Something that has been helpful to me in the past is this little piece by a writer I love. Isn't that wonderful? That's the invitation she honed over years of being a chaplain with people who would be seekers, perhaps, but a little allergic to traditional methods. Or then there's always that moment, what you've been saying reminds me of a short poem. May I share it? People almost always say yes. So one of the women who reviewed my book, Reverend Molly Bolton, has really taken this healing art on in a serious way. And she actually memorizes poems. She's probably got 20, 25, 30 poems in her repertoire that she memorizes while she's driving the car. She listens to them over and over. She records them for herself. She listens to them over and over until she can say them without a hitch. So she told this story, which she empowered me to share, of a time when she was making her rounds and she went into a room. Hi, I'm Chaplain Molly. Is it okay if I visit with you for a few minutes? And the two men who were sharing the room were deep, deep in conversation. So she said, if I'm interrupting something, please go ahead. I can come back later. No, Chaplain, they said, come on in. We're solving all the problems of the world. Well, it turned out one of the young men was 18 and he had just recovered from a drug overdose, or was in the hospital recovering. And the other man was quite a bit older, and he was a Vietnam veteran who had been early in his war experiences exposed to Agent Orange, and he was being treated for the long-term effects of that exposure. So the two of them were both very interested in what is life all about. And so they sat down and had a wonderful conversation with Chaplain Molly for over an hour. Well, eventually she had to move on because she had other people to call on. So she stood up and said, well, I have to go. I have other people I need to see, but this conversation has reminded me of a poem. Can I share it? And they said, sure. And so she said she shared it like a kind of benediction, and she used a poem. You might jot this down and look it up when we're finished here. It's a beauty. It's called Wild Geese, and it's by Mary Oliver. Very short and beautiful. And part of the poem says, you do not have to walk 100 miles on your knees. Listen to the non-judgmental, loving acceptance of humanity in those lines. You do not have to walk 100 miles on your knees You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the wild geese fly over." And there's a little bit more before it comes to a conclusion. She said by the time she finished reciting the poem, they had their arms around each other in a huddle, and there were tears running down all three of their faces. Now, the purpose of using poetry as a tool is not to make people cry. But I don't think you can argue that there was some deep connection made there, some healing happened there, some real joining with one another in humanity happened there. And it was a poem that helped them celebrate that at the end of the session. So Molly has her poems, up here in her head. And she told me that when she has ones that she doesn't have memorized, she keeps them on her phone. She can search her phone and they come up in an instant. But I have another friend closer to me in age who's adopted an old school method, and that works very well also. She carries on every visit a Bible and a binder, and the binder is full of poems. Now, I tried to find a picture to illustrate the story I'm going to tell you next. And I love this one because I love the pictures on it and so on. What I would not do if it was me is put poems down the spine of the binder because of what I've already said about some people being allergic or afraid of poetry. I'd leave that plain. I'd put pictures on the rest of it, inviting ones, hopefully. And she carries around this binder that looks like this. And it has those clear, like kind of folder. It has about 15 folders inside the binder. And she has about 15 poems that she's tested over the years and has found fit a lot of different situations. And she keeps multiple copies of each of those 15 poems in the binder so that if she's in a conversation where the person and the poem are a match, she can open the binder, pull the poem out, hand it to the person, and they can read it together or they can follow along while she reads it. And she said sometimes they will want to talk about it because something in it resonates with them right away. Sometimes she said if the person is hospitalized, for more than a day, she'll come back and visit them the next day and they'll be ready to talk about it. Because remember, we're ministering to both introverts and extroverts. Introverts want time to process their own thoughts. Extroverts discover their own thoughts as they talk them through with you. She told me the story of a man who was terminally ill. He was young, like 40-ish, 50-ish. He had been a super hard charger, really climbing the ladder all of his life. And unfortunately, he had spent so much of his energy climbing the ladder that he didn't seem to have a lot of close family. She had seen very few visitors in his room. And he was bitter and angry because he imagined that he would work real hard and then someday he would retire and live the good life. And now here he is terminally ill, and that hope is gone. And she had tried to talk to him about choosing a smaller hope that he could carry with him through his last days, but he didn't want to hear that. In fact, she said mostly he was pretty silent, and one time he just asked her to leave. But he was in so much pain that she did leave that day, but she said she came back again because it was hard to watch him suffer alone. And she brought with her one of the poems that's in the book called "If I Sing, I Weep." And it was actually her telling me this story that made us include that poem in the book. And "If I Sing, I Weep" is by a man, and it basically talks about how when I try to express myself, when I give what I feel words, i.e. when I sing from my personal life, I weep. And it's a beautiful poem. I hope somebody will look for it. And she said by the time she finished reading the poem, he was sobbing. Now, she did not read the poem with intent to, have him sob, but clearly she used her gift of presence to intuit that this poem might really give words to what this man felt. So those are two ways that you could use poetry in your ministry. All right. So if you're doing one-on-one, read it aloud, and use your presence to guide you in how to read it. How fast, how slow, what's this person seem like, what's their relationship to their suffering right now. If they are a slow talker, I would say read it slowly. If they're not a word person, give them time to let the images sink in. But you let the poem do the making of the connection. So basically you bring your presence to the poem, and the poem brings your presence to the person. And then you give the patient, or maybe a family who's keeping vigil with the patient, a printed copy of the poem to either look at now and talk about, or to leave behind. And they may respond to your invitation to share a favorite line or thought, or they might be willing to do that in the future, or they might do it with each other if it's a family later. One woman in hospice told me the story of how she often used poems to help family come to terms with the experience. And then they would write to her later and say, that poem you gave us while our loved one was in hospice, well, we read that at the funeral, or we read that at the wake, so it meant something to them. All right. So now we're going to go back to group for a minute, group process, because this is what we're going to experience together. So one voice reads a poem, and then you can make a little chiming sound. That's a terrible chiming sound. I forgot to bring my chime. Anyway, if you have a chime, use it. I have a little round metal singing bowl that I just strike lightly, and it makes a little ding. And then if there's time, invite a second member of the family, or the person you're doing spiritual direction with or pastoral counseling with, invite them to read the poem. This is how Stevens ministers use it. I've had the privilege of doing a couple of workshops/retreat days for Stevens ministers, and they've written to me afterwards saying that they use the mindful reading process just as I described it, and it almost invariably has a good impact. Then you give another minute of silence. So there's always the reading, then silence to absorb, then the reading, then silence to absorb or to let rise up. And then you might do the chime again. And then you, the facilitator or the spiritual director or pastoral counselor, chaplain, extend the invitation to speak a significant words or phrases out loud, or if it's a circle, as we are, into the circle. And then there's a small silence again, so that people can really listen to those. And then you just say, so what do you think? Or I invite you now to share, or whatever seems right. Okay. So in a minute, or a few minutes, I'm going to come back to these questions. Can you think of some uses for poems in a group setting? Grief groups, how could healthcare professionals use them? Funeral directors are using a lot of poetry in celebrations of life and remembrance services, or other groups you intersect with. But I want to escape this for a moment and actually put a poem up. So I have to do a new share to this. And what I'm hoping you're all seeing now, and Charlie, if we're not, tell me and I'll try to fix it, is a short poem called Up and Down. And I'm going to read it out loud since I'm your fearless leader here. Charlie, maybe would you be willing to read it once too? Maybe Charlie had to step away, which I don't blame him if he did. So here's the poem Up and Down, and this is in the book by Beverly Rollwagon. I don't know anything for sure unless I look it up. Sometimes I can figure things out if I write them down. So it's up and down all day long. It's a good life, better than back and forth or in and out, which I find constraining. I have up and down in balance, and with my mother's death, have discovered the true meaning of before and after. So let's just take a quiet minute. Hi, Charlie.
Hi, I'm here. I just lost the mute button. I didn't realize that was mute, so I'm here.
That's no worries. So we're going to give people a minute of silence to take that in. And then I'm going to ask you to read it if you don't mind. You can see it on the screen, right?
Yes, we can. Mm-hmm.
Good. All right, Charlie, if you'd read it for us in your own way, using your own
Sure.
emphases.
Up and down. I don't know anything for sure unless I look it up, but sometimes I can figure things out if I write them down. So it's up and down all day long. It's a good life, better than back and forth or in and out, which I find constraining. I have up and down in balance, and with my mother's death, have discovered the true meaning of before and after.
Thank you. Let's have another quiet minute and start to see which words or phrases or lines draw you or that you resist. All right, so I'm not sure our participants can unmute themselves. Is that right, Charlie?
That's right. They're not able
can't.
to.
So
Right.
we're gonna show them what it would be like. All right.
Okay.
So there would just what I would say to a group is, I invite you, jot this down if you want to try it, because this I've honed my way of doing it too. So I invite you to hold the silence while we speak words or phrases into our circle. So even if there's only 2 people or 3, it can still be our circle. Obviously, it's the whole family. If you're leading a group, it's easy to see it's our circle. And then there's usually a little silence. And then if nobody says anything, that's okay, because we're comfortable with silence. We understand ministry. Then I might just model for them and say, like one of my favorite lines in here is always, I don't know anything. Then there would be quiet. Then Charlie, can I impose on you to speak one?
Sure. The up and down really caught me, and then near the end, my mother's death.
Okay, thank you. And then we're not discussing it yet. So
Okay.
Charlie didn't, but if it looked like he was going to start talking about it, I would give him the quick hand signal and say, in a moment, we'll discuss it. Right now, we're just holding the silence while we speak a word or phrase. And when we do that, everybody gets it. Sometimes you just remind one time and then everybody gets it. So then someone else might say, it's a good life. Someone else around the circle might say, constraining. Charlie, do you have another one you might throw out?
Before and after.
Okay.
Mhm.
In balance often gets mentioned when I do this poem with somebody. So you see how that goes. Depending on the size of the group, it can last as long as 5 minutes, which is fine, because this is another way for the words of the poem to fall on our ears in different voices. And then when I think people are kind of finished with that, I might ring a chime again, or I'll just say, so what do you think? So let's go back to the questions that I put up before on the PowerPoint. Let's do share. Imagine that, you are using this poem with someone, or you are with a chaplain who has just read it to you. Can you think just for a moment with me? I'll give you some ideas, but I'd like you to think of your own first. And if you wish to, you can write them in the chat box, because in a minute, I'll ask Charlie and Dan, who's also monitoring chat boxes on YouTube, if anyone had anything to say. All right. But so we just heard up and down twice. We've spoken significant words or phrases into the circle. And now I'm inviting you to say, what comes up in you when you hear this poem? Remember, not what it means, but maybe what does it mean to you? What do you think might happen in a grief group if you said something like that? If you want to respond, put something in the chat box and we'll read your responses. Otherwise, I'll give you some samples. Or if you're a healthcare professional and you're working with someone whose loved one is in hospice, and they've just been confiding to you that they feel like they're losing their mind because there's so much to do, and they have grief brain themselves, so it's very hard to concentrate. And they've I feel like I'm losing my mind. I want to do everything I can for my mother, and I'm still raising kids. Can you see how this could be one of the poems that you would pull out of the book or pull out of the folder and say, you're not the first person who has felt like this. Now, some of you might say, oh, I couldn't use a poem that says, since my mother's death, I've learned the meaning of before and after with somebody whose mother hasn't died yet. I couldn't use that. But actually, you as a minister are probably in a pretty good position to see whether or not the person realizes that this person is going to die. Like, is the family member who you're doing ministry with, have they accepted that this is a terminal illness? And if they have, using that poem is giving them permission to say out loud, I wake up every night upset because I know my mother has very limited time left. You might be the first person they could say that to. Okay, so those are some of my ideas about how you might use it in ministry. Has anybody put anything in the chat boxes yet that we can share, Dan or Charlie?
Unless I'm missing something here, I don't see comments coming in. But David and Dakota, I think you've joined us
on YouTube.
And there isn't anything there, David?
No, I haven't seen anything there.
Okay. So I don't doubt that our viewers have ideas. I'm guessing they either want to think about it a little more or they don't care to write it in the chat box.
Do you see something, Dakota?
Charlie, that's me. I'm sorry.
That's you.
Oh,
Okay.
I didn't change my name. Sorry.
Okay.
Poor Dave. I called him Dan the whole first seminar, so you're just suffering from a name crisis here, Dave.
It's okay. I'm used to it.
I know what you mean. I answer to everything. So you can see also how the right poem might work well at a remembrance service or a celebration of life. So at my own mom's funeral, I used a poem from the book called What I Learned from My Mother. And people came up to me afterwards, and they wanted a copy of the poem because it was so perfect. They knew my mother and they knew it was perfect for my mother. It really celebrated her life. And the whole poem was just a series of things that the poet or the speaker in the poem had learned from their mother, how to comfort a whole grieving family with a huge jar of fruit salad, how to hold somebody's hand when they needed it, except it was said so beautifully because the poem was beautifully crafted. So I'm going to invite you, and I'm actually kind of sending you out like missionaries, just like I said in the first webinar, to take what you're learning about grief and poetry here, take it out to the world. And say you are clergy or a liturgical planner at a church, and your church is having a Blue Christmas service. If that's not a familiar term to you, many churches have come to recognize that in the United States, holidays are a really hard time for people. There's kind of a gauntlet, Thanksgiving and then Christmas and then New Year's, and all of those involve family gatherings. And the lack of a loved one is so enormously prominent at those holidays that what was formerly a great cause for joy and celebration now becomes a very bittersweet gathering because of the missing person. And so a lot of churches are starting to offer Blue Christmas, either prayer services or little support group of 2 to 3 weeks during Advent. And I've been asked to speak at some of them or help with some of them. And these poems are often very useful to open up the sharing part of such a gathering. You could even have people read a line each, arrange them around a circle, and have people go around the circle and each one read a line so that it becomes the group's expression. There are lots. This kind of thing I have on the WordSpa website. There's lots of ways to use it.
And I would add, Kim, that when you came to our church and we used the book in our seminar, there's a variety of poems in the book for different stages of grief. And that was also very helpful because different people were different in different places. Some had lost loved ones recently. Some were reflecting on a loss that had been painful, but had been a while back and such. And the different stages, I think having the poems kind of grouped in stages of grief is very helpful. and different people. And you can read the same thing, not to compare it to the Bible, but like the Bible, sometimes when you read it, the poem, if you're at a different stage, it ends up meaning something different, or you get something different
Yes.
out of it, reading it now versus 6 months from now, kind of thing.
Thank you for saying that, Charlie, because somebody just wrote to me recently, and she had experienced the poetry circle for the first time because she doesn't live in Greater Cleveland. So being on Zoom was her access point. She emailed me. We got her a link to the circle, and her husband was Lutheran clergy, and they were married long time. He was a poetry lover, but not she. So after his death, she started to read some of the things in his poetry books. And then someone gave her my book, a friend. She's reading it through for the third time. She says, as she moves, it's not linear. It's like as she moves up and down and in and out with her grief, the poems speak to her in different ways. And so it's just what Charlie said. And honestly, that was so much a part of my prayer when we were working on the book. Please help us to pick the poems that will offer the most layers so that no matter where people are in their grief, because remember, I'm talking poetry, but the book is about grief. All of the poetry is at the service of teaching people what will help them. What is the anticipatory grief? Is anger normal in grief? What's it like to be in the early stages of grief? What's the family dynamics? We're trying to teach and get people to reflect on all of those complicated aspects by choosing poems that, bring that up.
Now, I will also say, I know we're not promoting or we're not selling books,
No,
but I was reading your book, Kim, at the time when it was not planned, but a close relative died, and I had to put the book down because it was just too close, and so in a way that's good, because if you can read it like water rolling off a duck's back, you're reading it more of it as a novel or just a bedtime reading. It's not bedtime reading, but it's helpful, and I say that about having to put it down because it is so powerful and so helpful. And I'm true in interest of full confession, I'm not a poetry person myself. I'm not a particular lover of poems, but I found this very helpful. And the poems, as you said, you selected them. It's obvious that they're selected from a number. You didn't go out and leaf through a magazine as I'll stick this one in. And
no, there was none of that.
More to round out the chapter. It's very carefully and thoughtfully done, and very, very helpful.
Thank you. And Charlie, thank you for sharing that, because that gives us all permission to do our grief work at our pace. Others have said the same thing. Somebody gave this to me right when my loved one died. I couldn't do it then. 4 months later, 6 months later, a year later, I came back to it. I was able to use it with a journal. It was a completely different experience. So, everybody's different. And some people have said to me, I feel like this book's the only one who understands the way I grieved, because my family really did not get my grieving style, which was part of the intent, to be a comfort that accepts all different ways of approaching grief. But the goal is do your work. One of the chaplains, I said, I would end every interview, I'd say, what if you had one piece of advice that you were going to give my readers, what would it be? And she stopped for a minute and she said, do the work. If you shut yourself off from your grief, it will come back to grab you by the back of the neck, and it will give you a good shake. Isn't that a great image? And so, that's my hope. So this is my last slide, my friends. I want to echo Mary Oliver again. For poems are not words after all, but fires for the cold, ropes let down to the lost, something as necessary as bread in the pockets of the hungry. Whoa. Now you know why Mary Oliver felt called to poeting and never took an interesting job. That's her belief. So please feel free to visit wordspot.net. They're all free resources. You're very welcome to email me. I think you can email through the website, or it's kimlangley10@gmail.com if you have additional questions, or if you want to suggest another poem. that you think would be useful in my ministry, I'm always happy to hear them. And Charlie, I can't thank you enough for this opportunity. I mean, you can tell I'm on fire about this. So,
Right.
because I see what it does for people, and I know what it's done for me. And I'm just so grateful that you've given me this opportunity.
Well, thank you. And thank you for taking the time and being with us, Kim. And I want to remind us that all of these resources are going to be part of the presentation that you can go back and click on and look up, like word spot and things like that. And if you don't remember the website, you can go back to the presentation and find it again. And as David said, these are going to be up for a considerable time. And please feel free to email or text your friends and alert them to these seminars, because they are helpful. And sometimes I think we don't know what to say to people. We don't know, we want to be helpful. I just talked with somebody yesterday that their friend is, as they put it, down in the dumps. And, if we can point people to resources, sometimes we don't know what to say or what to do, but if we can show them to a resource, and also I think it's so helpful because these poems obviously illustrate to us that other people also have similar feelings. We're not the only one feeling lost or at loose ends or however we feel at the time, but there's other people, and we're not losing our minds. We're not going crazy, but we're doing the grief work, and
Right.
you have to have some unsettling times if you're really going to move ahead and continue the journey. I loved what Kim said about navigating the grief and carrying grief. We don't shed it, we don't get over it, but we learn to carry it better, just like you adjust a backpack on your back, and now you're able to walk up straight and you're able to maneuver it without getting a sore back or cuts in the back from how it lasts, because you learned how to do it. And I think that's more the image that we want to have.
That's a good
So
image.
thank you, Kim. You want to
Good
give us a
image.
parting word as we
I
sign
do,
off?
actually, if I may. I have a very short poem that is also
That's
in the book,
wonderful.
and it's by Rashani Raya. And when I talked to her to get the permission to use her marvelous poem, she told me that she wrote it in 1991 after the 5th death in her family within just a few years' time. So this poem absolutely comes out of her brokenness. This is no pep talk, all right? And it's called The Unbroken. There is a brokenness out of which comes the unbroken, a shatteredness out of which blooms the unshatterable. There is a sorrow beyond all grief, which leads to joy, and a fragility out of whose depths emerges strength. There is a hollow space too vast for words, through which we pass with each loss, and out of whose darkness we are sanctioned into being. There is a cry deeper than all sound, whose serrated edges cut the heart as we break open to the place inside, which is unbreakable and whole while learning to sing. That's a poem, but I think it's almost a prayer.
Yes, I agree.
And my prayer for all of us is that when grief comes our way, and it will, we are broken open and not broken apart, and then we can help to give that gift to others as well. Thank you all for being
Thank
here,
you.
and may your work prosper for the good of all.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Take
Thank you.
care. Bye now.
Bye-bye.